Beautiful anthem. Thank you, choir. Beautiful. And so as we continue in this season of Lent, as we focus on lifting high the cross, I invite you, if you have your Bibles, turn to the Gospel of Matthew, the 16th chapter. Look at verses 21 through 27. Beginning with the 21st verse of Matthew 16. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but rather the things of men." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done." Barbara Brown Taylor tells the story of a little boy named Jeff, who was the son of a friend of hers. One day when the boy was just 2 years old, he went for a ride with his granddaddy in his granddaddy's car. This was long before the time of seatbelts, so little Jeff was standing up on the front seat with his arm around his granddaddy. And along about a certain time, a dog ran across the street there. And so the granddaddy slammed on the brakes at the same time he was trying to grab his grandson, Jeff. But he wasn't quite successful because Jeff slammed his forehead into the dashboard, which made for a certain little sting for a moment, and the resulting 5-minute howl came out of him. When he finally came up enough to catch his breath, through his wet eyelashes, he looked at his granddaddy and said, "Pawpaw, what did I do wrong?" No, I get that some days. Some days I'm still that little boy sometimes. It hurts a little bit for me even still to hear that story. That little child's loss of innocence is something probably every adult in this room remembers experiencing at one time or another. Yeah, we go through life for a while. Everything is supposed to make sense. The good are rewarded, the evil are punished. But then one day life slams on the brakes, and we are reminded of that awful truth. You can do everything right and still get hurt. It's been a tough week for some people in this church. The untimely death of a 34-year-old Leslie, Andrew Wilson's mother. I saw her just a few days in the hospital before she died. She seems so alive. It's been a tough week. And I look at the life of Jesus, and sometimes it doesn't help that much, because think about it. Here was the most perfect person that ever lived in the world. And yet, what did it get him? All it got him was being strung up on an executioner's cross. The only and most surprising big difference between Jesus and us is that when it came to suffering and pain, while we run away from it, Jesus seemed to embrace it. In fact, he seemed to suggest that this is the only way that we can really know life. Most of us, we admire the daredevil at some degree, as long as we're not it. I look at my life and so many times, it saddens me to think of those times where my main motivation was simply to be safe, to make sure there wasn't any risk at all. And then I look at that all and wonder, how am I supposed to really know full life if that's the only goal my life has? And then I still fall into that even though I know better. That if I just do good, if I'm a good person, if I love Jesus, that maybe I'll have a little bit of an edge in my life. That I'll have just a little more of what God does for me going on. And then we bump up against these tragedies and these crises. And suddenly life slams on the brakes and we wonder if there's any sense to life at all. I think we all have a little bit of Peter, what we see in this story here this morning. Jesus told Peter what was coming. He said it's going to be ugly. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be painful. It's going to be humiliating. But also, it was going to be something that God was a part of. But Peter, of course, you knew it was going to be Peter. All Peter heard was the first part, the suffering and the death part. And so he says to Jesus, God forbid it, Lord, that this should ever happen to you. I don't think we should be too hard on Peter here. Sometimes he gets some bad press for what he says there at that moment. I think Peter simply didn't want his best friend to die. We all understand that. Why walk into a trap, Jesus, if you can walk away and be so much safer and still be alive? But for Peter, Jesus' death, I think at a deeper level, think about it. I think Jesus' death scared Peter to death. God forbid, Lord, may this never happen to you because, excuse me, if it can happen to you, then it can happen to me. If it can happen to somebody like you, my goodness, it can happen to anybody. If Jesus is vulnerable, then we are all vulnerable. And so Jesus comes back with the harshest rebuke found in all the Gospels. Get behind me, Satan. I think Peter touched a nerve here with Jesus. Maybe talked about a place where Jesus knew he was vulnerable. After all, at the very start of his ministry, Satan had tempted Jesus, and it never seemed to get any easier. And we know there on the night before he died, sure enough, even still at that last night, he was praying that somehow Jesus could remove that cup from him, take away that having to go forward with the cross. But for all that, Jesus stayed with the cross. He stayed with God when everybody else was running the other way to keep things as safe as possible. I think Jesus here was trying to teach his disciples something that I'm still trying to learn. I'm still trying to trust. I think it's this: if you're not afraid to lose your life, then you're more likely to find life. But if the main goal of your life is to keep things safe and protected and comfortable, then the likelihood is that you probably already have lost most of where the real life is to be found. You know, Tony Campolo, that fiery Italian preacher, I heard him preach many times. He'll get up in front of a group. He says, okay, how long have you been living? Tell your neighbor how long you've been living. So I'm Tony Campolo for a moment. I want you to turn to your neighbor, very simply say how long you've been living. I've been living 59 years. I know you thought it was much younger, but I've actually been 59 years. So I want you to turn to your neighbor, tell them how long you've been living. Okay, come on back. All right, how many of you told the truth? Okay. Then Tony Campolo, after all that mass pandemonium, then he would take the scalpel, he would put it right where it hurts, and he says, okay, how long have you been alive? With the realization that for many of us, it's not the same answer. Yeah, it's fascinating. Jesus pointed to a symbol of death as a sign of life. Remember, the cross at this point had no religious meaning at all because Jesus had not died on one at that point. The cross was simply the worst, ugliest, humiliating form of execution that the Romans could come up with. It was said that the streets to Jerusalem were lined with bodies of people, and some still dying, hung on crosses, because crosses were not just for pain, they were for intimidation. It reinforced that death was the worst thing ever in life, and if that you had any sense at all, you would run from it for all that you could. But Jesus here seems to be saying there are some things that are worse than death. Maybe right at the top of the list is to live a life always of fear. Think about it. If fear runs your life, then fear is your God. Think about it. If you're scared of something, you don't do it. If you aren't scared, you do it. And so think about how much, in fact, fear really does just run our lives and become a God almost. And the tragedy is that many of us can be so controlled by our fears that we can get to the end of life and discover we never really lived at all. And so there's always a choice. You can play it safe, or you can hear what is said over 300 times in the Bible. Be not afraid. That voice will not promise you safety. That voice will promise you life. One time when I was living in High Point, I was at the Lowe's supermarket. I was going there to buy just some bottled water. This was back before bottled water was so popular. And so, as always was the case when I'm in a supermarket, of course, I couldn't find it for anything. Just a universal experience I have. And so I'm there and finally couldn't find the bottled water anywhere. And so I asked the clerk, where might I find the bottled water? She said, it's over in the wine section. And I'm thinking, well, if I go over in the wine section, I'm probably going to run into some of my deacons. But I took a chance. I went over there, and sure enough, they happened to be over in the beer section, so no problem. And I'm in the wine section, and I couldn't find bottled water anywhere. So I turned to a lady who was, generously in her early 80s. I said, do you know where the bottled water is? She looked at me and she said, young man, are you hitting up on me? True story. I said, no, I'm really just looking for bottled water. Yeah. She said, well, you can't be too careful these days. I think what Jesus is saying here is that you can be too careful sometimes. But deny yourself and take up a cross. Who needs that? Most of us have a hard enough time getting out of bed, getting food on the table, making it through the day. Deny yourself, take up a cross. Most of us have a hard enough time just making life work day to day. And he then gives us this kind of invitation. Why in the world would we walk into a trap when we can walk away? Why would we take a risk when we can keep things safe in our life? Have you ever known some who have headed that way? We read those in stories in the newspaper sometime of the person who runs into the fiery building to rescue someone, or the person who goes out on the frozen pond and rescues somebody that has fallen through the ice. Or there's the more quiet ones like I know about, of the doctor who goes to Durham a couple of nights a week and gives free medical care to a homeless person. Or the teenager who goes and rocks little babies who have AIDS in the hospital. Or the teacher who gives it all up and takes all her life savings and goes to the Dominican Republic to teach little children how to read. We know of those kind of people and we admire them, but something about us really kind of wonders about them as well. And so we protest along with Peter. Isn't there some easier way? God forbid it, Lord, that this should ever happen to you. God forbid it, Lord, that this should ever happen to me. And I think what Jesus is saying is that something does happen to you. you become smaller. Fear starts controlling your life. You start letting something else be your God. You lose control. 2,000 years later, our own crosses have nothing to do with standing up to the Roman government. But fear is timeless. And my guess is every one of us in this room is afraid of something. Maybe it's that your secret will get out. And what will people think of you then? Maybe it's fear of how well your finances are going to go come retirement time. Maybe it's fear that someone you love more than life itself might not be around but so long. Whatever your fear is, that can absolutely rob you of life. What I think Jesus is saying here is the way to abundant life is not to save it, but to spend it. Not to be safe with it, but to be giving it away. Because life, as Barbara Brown Taylor so beautifully puts it, she said, life cannot be shut up and saved any more than a bird can be put in a shoebox and put on a shelf. Better yet, she says, life cannot be shut up and saved any more than fresh water can be put in a mason jar and kept in a kitchen cupboard. It will remain water. And if you ever open it, you can probably still drink it, but it will have lost its essence, its life, which is to be poured out, to be moving, to be living water, rushing downstream, to share its wealth without ever looking back. Stop running from the cross, Jesus says. Stop running from life. And all you have to do is to believe in God more than you believe in your fear. How long have you been living? Our hymn of invitation, hymn of invitation this morning, hymn number 305, I have decided to follow Jesus. Maybe there are some who are not ready to go all the way, but you're ready to take that first step, which is all Jesus invites you to do, to come and make your profession of faith and allow him to be your Lord and Savior. Or maybe some who wish to unite with this church with another church family, or some making some renewed commitment, whatever God is leading you. I'll be at the front to receive you. Let us stand and sing to the glory of God, hymn number 305.